The tunnel swallowed the transport in darkness, and when it came out the other side, Warrant Officer De Isle Karras was somewhere else entirely, geographically. The hull coordinates still read Sector 7, Waystation Mirren, Docking Arm 4. The light was wrong. The other ships in the bay were wrong. Their lines too clean. Their registry numbers stenciled in a font that hadn't been used since the first colonial expansion, when humanity was still deciding if it wanted to survive or simply scatter and hope. And the people moving along the gantries below wore the kind of work clothes that had gone out of fashion 200 years ago, back before the Varath Dominion first made contact, and humanity stopped worrying about fashion altogether. Karras pressed his palm to the cold porthole glass. He was 41 years old. He had a wife back on Callisto Station whose voice he was forgetting a little more each year. The way you forget the details of a room you no longer visit. He had a job he was good at. Logistics coordination for the Sector 7 Transit Authority. And a life that had become, without his noticing, a very convincing imitation of a life. He had model starships on a shelf in quarters he barely slept in, antique kits, pre-contact designs, the kind of vessels humanity had once dreamed up without knowing anything was out there waiting. He built them by hand. He had started building them when the treaty negotiations with the Varath Dominion began 16 years ago. And he had never really stopped. His wife had stopped asking what they were for. The answer had never changed. They were for remembering. He had boarded this transport at Waystation 6 hours ago, carrying a battered cargo manifest and a pocket-sized mechanical chronometer he'd found 3 days earlier in an antiques booth on Miran's lower concourse. The vendor had been an old man with the careful, particular eyes of someone who had been watching people for a very long time and understood what that watching was for. He had pressed the chronometer into Karras' hand before Karras had even asked the price, the way you press something into someone's hand when you know they need it and also know they won't realize they need it until much later. It runs a little peculiar, the old man had said. His voice had the quality of a place where time moved differently. It always tells the right time, just maybe not your time. Karras had laughed at that. He wasn't laughing now. He stood up and walked to the transport's forward hatch. The lock cycled, the ramp extended, and he walked down into a docking bay that smelled of machine oil and torch weld, and something else. Something alive in particular. The smell of a place that had not yet surrendered its character to efficiency. The smell of a way station, when way stations had still been built by human hands, for human reasons, before every design was filed with the Dominion's infrastructure oversight committees and returned with 27 suggested improvements that somehow always resulted in something a little less specific to the people who would be living in it. A dock worker looked at him with mild curiosity. No Varath-compliant sensor at the ramp's base. No biometric reader blinking its pale amber light. No thin, iridescent film on the walls that always meant Dominion infrastructure. Dominion monitoring, Dominion patience, Dominion presence threading through the bones of every human-built structure that had been standing for more than a decade. Just a man in overalls with a wrench in his belt, and then the distinct expression of someone wondering why a stranger was standing at the bottom of a ramp, looking like he'd just survived something he wasn't able to explain. "You all right?" the dock worker said. "I'm not sure," Karras said honestly. The dock worker shrugged with the equanimity of someone who had seen many things come off the transit lines and had learned not to draw conclusions before breakfast. Karras walked into the station. Her name was Maren Saul. She ran the way station's public information service. Not a terminal feed, not an augmented data layer, not a Dominion-cleared broadcast queue, but an actual printed circular that went out 3 times a week to every berth and compartment in the station. Hand-distributed by a network of dock workers who took it as part of their unofficial responsibilities, along with fixing things that weren't their job to fix, and knowing whose birthday it was. She had ink on her fingers from the morning's run and a look in her eyes that Karras would later describe to himself with some embarrassment and considerable precision, as like the feeling of coming back to a room you'd thought you'd forgotten and finding it exactly as you'd left it. She found him trying to read a bulletin board on the Inoir's upper concourse, confused by the date stamps, which were dated 203 years before the morning he'd woken up on. "You're from off-station," she said. "Not a question." "I'm from a different time," he said, because he had decided within approximately 30 seconds of walking through the station gate that honesty was the only strategy available to him. He had no cover story, no false identity, no prepared explanation. He had a cargo manifest for a way station that didn't exist yet, and a chronometer that ran peculiar. "I can't fully explain it. I don't think I understand it myself." She studied him the way someone studies a piece of machinery they haven't seen before. Not with fear, not with dismissal, but with the particular focused interest of someone who has made it their professional business to understand how things work, even when things are new. "Chronometer," she said. He took it out. She looked at it without touching it, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but recognition of a category. The expression of someone for whom a peculiar thing has just become a slightly less peculiar thing. "My grandmother wrote about one of those," she said. "In her journals," she said. "A man came through the transit tunnel carrying a watch like that. She said he looked lost the first time and at peace the second time." "Did she say what happened to him?" "She said he made a choice." Karras turned the chronometer over in his hands. The case was warm, even though the bay air was cold, which was not a property of metal in a cold environment, and which he had noticed but had been deliberately not thinking about. Mechanism ticked with an evenness that felt less like clockwork and more like breathing. "I need to understand what's happening," he said. "Not just to me. All of this." He gestured at the station around him. The actual human architecture of the place, the mismatched panels, and the water-stained ceiling above dock level, and the bulletin board with its hand-pinned papers, and the dock worker eating his lunch against a bulkhead without a compliance screen in sight. "This is why it still looks like this." "Come on then," she said, and walked. Karras learned over the next week, and it was a full week, because the tunnel only cycled every 7 days, and he had no other way home, and had spent half a day confirming there was no other way home. Was that the way station he had arrived in was not the past, in any conventional sense. It was a fracture, a place where the timeline had bent around a peculiarity in the local gravitational field, the way a current bends around a stone without being stopped by it. The fracture was old. No one on this version of Meran called it a fracture. They called it the Stillwater, a region of particular quiet near the station's outer docking ring, where the transit lanes passed through a gravitational eddy that had been mapped but never fully explained. Ships that came through Stillwater sometimes arrived with their internal clocks wrong by hours or days. Occasionally, cargo manifests arrived dated to years that hadn't happened. 3 times in the restored history of the station, a passenger had stepped off the ramp, claiming to be from the future. The first 2 had been frightened, and then disbelieved, and then, eventually, absorbed into the station community, where they had lived out ordinary lives that were, by all accounts, decent and purposeful, and not without joy. The third, a navigation officer, apparently, who had been very certain about what she needed to do, had gone back through the tunnel in a borrowed shuttle, and had never been seen again on this side. Karras thought about that a lot. The Verath Dominion did not exist in this version of history. Not yet. He kept waiting for the familiar signs, the inspection officers with their pale, jointless hands and their cataloging eyes, the compliance panels, the atmospheric processing with its faint alien signature, the constant low hum of Dominion orbital infrastructure that had become, in his time, simply the sound of inhabited space. There was none of that here. There was just humanity, doing what humanity did in the absence of oversight, improvising, arguing, building things slightly wrong, and then fixing them, falling in love, running way stations, writing circulars, and tinkering with chronometers that did not belong to them. He helped Merrin with the circular. He knew things she didn't. Not secrets, exactly, just the angle of history, the way you can see a wave forming if you're standing far enough along the shore. He helped her write a piece about expansion lane safety that would, if history played out as he knew it, prevent a collision event scheduled to occur 6 months from now. She looked at him with a particular sideways calculation when he explained how he knew the timing. "Telling me you've seen records of this. In my time, there's a memorial at Way Station 4. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notes. How many names on it? 12. We have 14 berths on that lane right now. I know, he said. You can get it to 12 if you run the safety check I've written up. You'd need to do it in the next 40 days, or the maintenance cycle gets locked by the cargo contract renewal. She looked at him for a long moment. Expression was the one he was becoming familiar with. Not quite trust, not quite suspicion, but the considered middle ground of a person who had spent their professional life being skeptical of stories and attentive to evidence. Why do you care? Shia said. This isn't your time. He thought about that. He thought about his wife's voice going quieter in his memory over 16 years of polite, comfortable, slowly narrowing life. He thought about the model ships on their shelf, all those pre-contact designs, all those old dreams of what the stars might hold if humanity reached for them on its own terms. He thought about 16 years of watching the Verith Dominion gradually, politely, comprehensively rewrite the operating manual of human civilization. While humanity said yes and yes because the alternative was unthinkable. Maybe that's why I'm here, he said. Because I stopped caring about my own time enough. She considered this. It's honest. It's the least I can do, he said. The Dominion had not conquered humanity. This was what the history texts said. The approved history texts. The ones cleared by Dominion oversight committees, written by historians, who had learned the particular skill of describing a thing in language that made it sound like its opposite. What those texts said was that the Dominion had extended a framework of interstellar civilization to a species not yet ready to extend it to themselves. That integration had been voluntary, that the treaty was mutual, that the relationship was one of equals at different stages of development, that the guidance provided was that of an older sibling, not a warden. Chris had read those texts in a school on Callisto when he was 12 years old. He had not had another interpretation available until he was 32, when he met a historian named Veskalin who was, at that time, 3 months away from being permanently relocated to a research station so remote it might as well have been the dark side of a moon in an unnamed system. Olin had given him a data chip no larger than his thumbnail and told him not to read it until he was somewhere private, and the nearest compliance panel was at least 2 compartments away. The chip contained Olin's actual research, not the approved version. The version, Olin, had been building for 11 years before the Oversight Committee had begun to pay attention. What the Dominion had actually done was simpler and more patient than conquest, more sophisticated than colonization, and far harder to argue against than either. They had arrived at exactly the right moment, when humanity was frightened and fractured, and reaching desperately for stability after 2 decades of internal crises that had left the species exhausted. The Dominion had offered that stability, and with the stability had come gradually and almost invisibly the infrastructure, the oversight, the compliance, architecture, the monitoring systems, and the slow and methodical replacement of human decision-making with something smoother, more efficient, and incrementally less human. Cruelty. The Verith Dominion were not as a species cruel, they were curators. They collected civilization science the way his mother had collected antiques, with genuine appreciation for the old thing's beauty, and a complete failure to understand that the value of a living thing was in its living, not its preservation. 16 years in, humanity still had its languages and its faces and its approximate customs. What it had given up, without ever quite realizing it was giving something up, was the stubborn and inconvenient habit of deciding for itself. Karis thought about all of this on the 3rd evening, while helping Marin set the letter type for the circular next morning run. Print room was warm from the press and the single overhead lamp. It smelled of ink and machine oil and the faint wood smoke of the station's old radiant heating system, which worked in the way old systems worked. Imperfectly and completely. You're somewhere else, Marin said without looking up. I'm thinking about where I came from, he said. What it became. What did it become? He pressed a letter block into the compositing tray. The metal was warm from the lamp. Queeter, he said. She stopped and looked at him. In the print room's amber light, her expression had the quality of something clear and unashamed. The look of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about caring. Tell me. She said so he did. He told her about the treaty, about the compliance panels and the atmospheric processing and the way Dominion infrastructure sounded. That constant low hum that you stopped noticing after a year and only missed when you were somewhere it wasn't. He told her about the slow erosion of the ordinary human right to make bad decisions and fix them, about how human governance had been restructured twice in the name of efficiency and 3 times in the name of safety, and was now, on paper, still human in origin and in practice, a shell through which Dominion recommendations passed so regularly and so smoothly that there was no practical difference between advice and instruction. He told her about Vescallen and the data chip. He told her about the memorial at Waste Station 4 with 12 names that should have been 14 if the Dominion's efficiency protocols hadn't quietly overridden the standard safety check procedure. He told her about the way the Dominion oversight committees smiled when they refused requests. Always patient, always genuine, always immovable. The smile of a species that had already decided what was best for you and was simply waiting for you to agree. Shh, she listened, without interrupting. When he finished, she picked up her compositing stick and kept working. And people just let that happen, she said. People were frightened. And the Dominion was very good at being the only available answer to the thing they were frightened of. That's not a reason, she said quietly.
That's an excuse.
He looked at her. I know, he said. I've known it for a long time. I just didn't know what to do about it. She looked at him sidelong, both hands still on the compositing work. And now, he didn't answer. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer required saying out loud something he hadn't yet let himself say. Now, he said finally, I think I might. The chronometer told him on the 5th day that the tunnel was going to cycle early. He knew it the way he'd learned to know things about the watch. Not through any particular analytical process, but through attention. The quality of noticing that comes from actually looking at a thing rather than looking past it. The mechanism had changed its rhythm in a way that was almost inaudible but entirely present. A faint hesitation between the second hand's beats that hadn't been there when he'd first opened the case. He sat in the print room on a Tuesday morning while Marin ran the press and timed the chronometer against the station clock on the wall and confirmed what he suspected. The tunnel was cycling in 48 hours, not 2 more days. He had been going back and forth about the decision for 5 days. He had been doing this while pretending it was no decision at all, which is the technique used by people who have already decided and are not ready to admit it. He went to find Marin. She was at the public board on the upper concourse, pinning the morning circular to the display frame with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom the act of making information available to people was not a job but a conviction. The station was waking up around her. Foot traffic on the gantries, the smell of coffee from the commissary 2 levels down, the sound of someone arguing loudly and without apparent distress about a cargo manifest below. It felt more real to him than anything he could call to mind from his own time. Not better, necessarily, not simpler, for sure. Just more fully itself, still in the process of being decided, still carrying the friction and noise of a civilization that had not yet had that noise smoothed away. Tunnel cycles in 2 days, he said, earlier than I thought. She pinned the last sheet and smoothed it flat with her palm. I know. I need to make a decision. There's one decision, she said. She turned and looked at him without theater or performance, with the clarity she brought to everything. Go home or stay. The rest of it, what happens after, what it means for the people in both directions, that's complicated. Choice itself is simple. My wife, he said. I know it's not. It isn't about you. Want you to understand that. She looked at him steadily. I know it isn't. I'm not asking you to stay for me. I'm not asking you to stay at all. She paused. What I'm asking is whether the life you're going back to is a life that needs you. Whether you walking back into it makes anything better for anyone who's there. Another pause, shorter. Including you. He thought about his wife. He thought about their conversations in the last 2 years, which had been careful and polished and calibrated. The conversations of 2 people who had become genuinely skilled at not saying the thing they were actually thinking. He thought about going home to a station where the air tasted faintly of Dominion atmospheric processing, and every security panel ran Dominion software, and his shelf of antique model ships was, in the final accounting, the loudest thing in his quarters. He thought about what the ships were for, remembering. "I know what I need to do," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Which is?" "Go back," he said. "But not to what I left." He did not stay for Marin. He was honest with himself about that at least. He had 5 days to consider every possible interpretation of what he was doing, and he was honest enough to rule them out one by one. He wasn't because he'd fallen in love with a woman from 200 years before his time. Though there was something real there, something that deserved the respect of being named clearly rather than dismissed. He wasn't staying because the past was better than the future. It wasn't, not in any broad sense, not if you factored in the medicine and the communications and the understanding of the physical universe that 2 more centuries of human curiosity had produced. And he wasn't staying because he was afraid of going back to a life that had become a very convincing imitation of a life. Fear was a poor compass. He was going back because of what he'd told her in the print room, because of the chance, however improbable, however uncertain, however likely to amount to nothing at all, that what he knew and what he'd learned and what 16 years of polite dispossession had etched into him might be useful in a version of history where the Dominion hadn't arrived yet, where there was still time, where a person who knew the exact shape of what was coming, who had watched the mechanism operate from inside it, might be able to do something that mattered. The night before the tunnel cycled, he sat in the station's observation bay, a pressurized dome of old glass and structural steel, the kind of engineering that had been built to last rather than to specification, built with the generous excess of a civilization that hadn't yet learned to be economical about beauty, and looked out at the stars. They were the same stars. They always would be. What was different was the silence between them, the absence of relay stations and compliance pings, and the faint electromagnetic signature of a civilization that had been quietly catalogued and shelved. He sat with the chronometer in both hands and thought about ink. He had spent the last 4 days in every hour Marin didn't need him in the print room, writing. Not quickly, carefully, in the kind of longhand that had been made necessary by the understanding that ink on paper carried no digital signature, no timestamp, no file metadata. It could not be detected by a compliance scan. It could not be flagged by a monitoring system that was looking for certain keywords in digital text, be passed from hand to hand, reproduced by hand, distributed by hand. It was the oldest information technology humanity had, and the one the Dominion had never thought to account for, because the Dominion worked in data and had not fully appreciated that data and information were not the same thing. Written down everything, the mechanism of the compliance architecture from the inside out, treaty clauses and their operational interpretations, which diverged in ways the treaty text did not make obvious. The names of the oversight committee members, and the specific decision points at which human governance had been gradually substituted. The gaps, the monitoring gaps, the bypass vectors, the places where the architecture had been built with the assumption that no one who mattered would know to look. Vescolin's data, reorganized into a form that could be reproduced by hand and distributed without a trail. He had approximately 400 pages. He had also written what Marin had called the other thing, the account. Tick analysis, not political argument, not a manifesto, just the account. What he had seen, what he had lived in, what it felt like from the inside when you were a person inside a civilization that had been made efficient. The detail of it, the way the compliance panels looked, and what you stopped feeling after a year of seeing them every day. The texture of a life that was comfortable and narrowing and comfortable in the way that narrowing things are comfortable, the way a corridor feels safe because you cannot fall sideways in it. He thought Olan would know what to do with both. The old man from the antiques booth was in the observation bay. Karras was not surprised. He sat down beside Karras with the easy posture of someone who had been sitting with complicated things for a very long time, and had made their peace with the fact that complicated things did not resolve into simple things. They resolved into clarity about what the complicated thing actually was. How many times? Karis said. How many times what? How many people has that watch brought through the tunnel? The old man was quiet. He looked at the stars. Enough, he said at last, and not enough. Is there a right choice? Back or stay? There's the choice that's yours, the old man said. That's all a choice ever is. He paused. Some of them went back. Some stayed. Some did things that mattered. Some spent their years regretting they hadn't. One man, this was a long time ago, or what counts as a long time for something like the Stillwater, spent 17 years in a time that wasn't his, and then used what he'd learned to do something that people still talk about without knowing it. What did he do? Wrote it down, the old man said. Everything he knew. Gave it to the right person. He looked at Karis sidelong. You know someone like that. I might, Karis said. The tunnel cycles in 4 hours, the old man said. He stood, unhurried. The watch decides when the last passage closes. Not the tunnel, the watch. You'll know when it's the last one. How will I know? The ticking changes. He paused in the doorway. It gets quiet. The way something gets quiet when it's been listening instead of running. He left. Karis sat with the chronometer against his sternum, the packed and folded pages in his jacket's inner pocket, and the stars above him through old glass, and felt the weight of 400 pages and 16 years, and one decision that had already, quietly, been made. He found Marin in the print room. She was running the evening edition, the press cycling, with its reliable mechanical rhythm. And she looked up when he came in, and the look on her face told him she already knew what he was going to say. She had known for 2 days. She had been letting him get there in his own time, which was, he had come to understand, the primary quality that made her who she was. The patience to let a thing be what it was, without deciding in advance what it needed to become. I'm going back, he said. I know, not to what I left, to what I have to do with what I know. He crossed the room. He set the chronometer on the composting table between them, not giving it to her, not taking it back, setting it down in the space between two people, in the way that significant things are placed when there are no more words that fit. Thought there would be a moment, a reason that would make it clear. I've been here a week, watching you run a station that works the way a station is supposed to work. And every morning I think about a world where that got replaced with something that worked better in every measurable way, except the only way that matters. And I think I'm the wrong person to stay here. I think I'm the person who goes back. She looked at the chronometer. What will you do? There's a historian named Olin, 3 months before they relocate him permanently. He touched the pages inside his jacket. He has the analysis. I have the mechanism and the account. Together, we have something that goes out in ink on paper to enough hands that pulling it back becomes harder than letting it change something. It might not work. I know. The Dominion doesn't lose gracefully. No. They're but used to species that push back through the approved channels. They haven't dealt with one that just keeps being inconvenient in every possible direction simultaneously. He almost smiled. Very good at that. She looked at him. The press ran behind her. She picked up the chronometer and turned it over in her ink-stained hands, the casing catching the lamp's amber light. Will you remember this, she said. Not the station, not the week, not herself. This. The particular quality of a moment that is ordinary and irreversible and matters in the way that small, true things matter. Everything, he said. She held the chronometer for another moment. Then she placed it back in his hand. Fingers were warm. Then go do what you're for, she said. He went back through the tunnel on the 4-hour mark, sitting in the forward berth of a borrowed survey shuttle, holding the chronometer against his chest with both hands. The tunnel transit took 30 seconds. During those 30 seconds, the light went strange, and the instrument readings went strange, and the chronometer went very quiet. Not stop, not wrong, just quiet. The particular silence of something that has been listening instead of running. When the tunnel opened on the other side, everything was exactly as he had left it. Compliance panels, atmospheric processing with its faint alien signature, the low, omnipresent hum of Dominion orbital infrastructure, Waystation Mirren Docking Arm 4, Sector 7, a pleasant, synthesized voice informed him that his biometrics were on file, and his transit was logged, and his return was expected. He sat in the shuttle for a long moment and breathed the air of his own time, which tasted faintly of competent management, and felt the 400 pages inside his jacket and the chronometer's warmth in his hand. Trees, he set a course for Callisto. Vesk Olin met him in a commissary near the historian's office, in the kind of afternoon crowd where two people could sit across from each other and not be remarkable. Olin had coffee in front of him, one cup, not two, plausible deniability. He had the careful, worn look of someone who had spent too long being exactly as cautious as the situation required, which was very. Karis sat without being invited. He understood that time was one of the things Olin was running low on. I know about the chip, Karis said. I know about the research. I know about the relocation order and the timeline for implementation. And I know something you don't. Olin's expression did not change. He was very good at not changing his expression. What could someone in your position know that would be worth the risk of telling me? Karis set the chronometer on the table. Olin looked at it without touching it. Something moved in his eyes. Not recognition, but the quality of mind that precedes recognition. The door that opens just before you know what's on the other side. I know the mechanism, Karis said. Not the broad outlines, the specific architecture, the compliance bypass vectors, the treaty clause operational interpretations, the monitoring gaps, and the decision points, specific, named, dated, where what happened in the approved history and what actually happened diverge. He paused. And the account. What it feels like from inside. The texture of a civilization that's been made efficient. The specific things that go quiet, so gradually you don't notice until you're shoved somewhere quiet hasn't reached yet. He slid the folded papers across the table. 400 pages, folded and bundled, in a stack that was slightly thicker than it looked. Olin looked at them for a long moment without picking them up. He was the kind of historian who had learned to treat every document as potentially a test, which was the correct approach for someone in his position. How, he said. I made a choice, Karis said. In a tunnel. I went somewhere that was a long time ago, and I watched something work the way it used to work. And I came back knowing that what we lost wasn't inevitable. He met Olin's eyes. It was chosen. By us, under circumstances we didn't choose. That's different from inevitable. Inevitable you can't do anything about. Chosen means there's a decision point, and decision points can be revisited. Olin picked up the papers. He unfolded the first section and read with the particular velocities of someone who has spent their career being able to assess a document's quality in the first paragraph. His face did not change. He moved quickly, and then, slowly, and stopped at a specific point on the page, and he was still for a moment, in the way of someone encountering information that reorganizes the structure around it. If this is accurate, he said quietly, without looking up, and if this is distributed before the relocation order processes, it needs to go out in ink, Karis said. Hand to hand, no digital trace. I know that limits the initial distribution, but it means the first wave reaches people before any compliance flag goes up. And by then it's in enough hands that suppression creates more attention than release would have. I know people, Olin said. People who've been waiting for something like this. Who know how to do what you're describing. He was quiet for a moment. How many copies can you make in 3 months? As many as there are hands to make them, Karis said. That's the whole point. It's not a document. It's a template. Olin folded the papers and held them in both hands, and his face did something complicated. Not quite hope, not quite grief. The expression of someone who has carried a truth for a very long time and is only now being told they can set it down. The Dominion will push back, he said. Yes, hard, yes. But they're very good at managing civilizations that resist through approved channels. They've been doing it for a long time. What they're not used to, what no curator is ever quite prepared for, is the thing in the collection that won't stop moving. Karis leaned forward, and there was nothing performed about what he said next. No rhetoric, no speech. Just the truth as he had lived it, and carried it through a tunnel and back. The Dominion thinks they understand humanity. They've been observing us for 20 years. They have our languages, our customs, our complete cultural archive. They have a sophisticated model of how we respond to restriction, and how we respond to comfort, and what makes us cooperate. What their model doesn't account for is this. We have always, throughout our entire history, treated being managed as a temporary condition. You take away our vote, we find another vote. You take away our records, we write them in ink. You catalog our civilization. We build models of the old ships on shelves, and we remember what they were built for. Put us in a tunnel, and we come out somewhere else and we bring the information back. He held Olin's gaze. The Dominion is very patient, but we are very inconvenient. And inconvenience, sustained and deliberate and distributed across enough hands, is harder to suppress than anything that has a single point of failure. Olin looked at him for a long time. Around them the commissary moved with its ordinary life. People eating, people arguing, people conducting the small transactions of an existence that had been made efficient, and was still stubbornly, full of exactly the kind of noise that efficiency was supposed to eliminate. All right, Olin said. What happened after was not clean, and not quick, and not a story that resolved into a single decisive moment where everything changed at once. It was the other kind of story, the kind that happens in small rooms in commissary and corridors, in ink on paper, passed hand to hand without metadata, in the particular stubbornness of people who have been told a story about themselves for 16 years and have just been given the other story and recognize it immediately and without question as true. It took 6 years. There were people who lost jobs, and people who were relocated, and people who said it wasn't possible. There were negotiations that broke down and reconvened. There were historians and engineers and cargo haulers, and print room workers, and survey pilots and dock workers who took things as part of their unofficial responsibilities. And one retired warrant officer with a shelf of antique model ships who spent 6 years being consistently and systematically and humanly inconvenient to a civilization that had honestly not anticipated that particular response. Not because it was irrational, it was entirely rational to resist, but because their models of resistance assumed a central node to suppress, a leader to relocate, a document to classify. They encountered instead was distributed, headless, made of ink on paper, and personal conversations and the specific knowledge of people who had lived inside the mechanism and understood it from the inside out. You cannot suppress a thing that has no center. You cannot classify a thing that exists in 1,000 handwritten copies in 1,000 different places. You can make it harder. You can make it slower. You cannot make it not exist. At the end of the 6th year, a revised treaty was proposed by a coalition of human governance bodies that had, for the first time in 16 years, a majority that did not owe its composition to Dominion infrastructure management. The Dominion negotiated in good faith. They were not cruel. They had never been cruel. They were simply encountering something. Their long experience with civilizations had not fully prepared them to navigate. A species that treated its own domestication as fundamentally temporary, that was capable of extraordinary patience in the service of fundamental inconvenience, that would agree to 100 small things and resist the one large thing endlessly and without obvious coordination. The revised treaty language guaranteed human decision-making authority over human infrastructure, human governance of human expansion, human oversight of the compliance architecture that remained in place for legitimate coordination. Because the Dominion was still there, still a neighbor, still the civilization that humanity had first met at the edge of the stars, and there was real value in that. There had always been real value in that. The question had never been whether to have a relationship with the Dominion. Question had been whether the relationship would be one between parties who could say no to each other. Now they could. It was not the world Karras had come from. It was not the world he'd glimpsed through the still water. It was its own thing, louder than either, more complicated than either, carrying the friction of two civilizations figuring out how to be genuinely different from each other without that difference becoming a wound. It was, in the exact sense that mattered, decided. Karras was not at the signing. He was on way station Miran, in the public observation bay, looking at the stars through old glass in a pressurized dome that had been built to last. The dome was the original structure. They had preserved it during the renovation cycles, not because it was efficient, but because the station's inhabitants had voted to keep it. 6 times over 60 years, each time the efficiency review came up, There was no equivalent vote under Dominion management. There was now. He held the chronometer. It ticked with its usual evenness, the evenness that had always reminded him of breathing, steady, present, unhurried, the rhythm of something alive. 2. He thought about ink. About a woman with ink on her fingers, in a print room that existed 200 years away, and yesterday, and always, depending on where you were standing in the current. About what she had said, go do what you're for. He thought about 12 names on a memorial that had been built because 2 people had died who hadn't had to. And then he thought about everything that had been built in the 6 years after Callisto, the network, the documents, the 100 small decisions that had accumulated into something large enough to matter. About how much of that had started in a print room with 1 week and 400 pages and the simple knowledge of what was coming and what could be stopped. He pressed his thumb to the chronometer's case. The second hand moved, steady. The ticking was ordinary, not quiet, not listening instead of running, just running, the way a thing runs when it has done the work it came to do. He turned the case over in his hand and thought about the old man's face in the antique booth, pressing the watch into his palm, and what it would mean to know you had been carrying the right thing to exactly the right place. Not destiny. He didn't believe in that. Something simpler. The way the right tool finds the right hand if you pay enough attention to both. Put the chronometer in his jacket pocket. It sat there warm against his ribs. Outside the old glass, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The relay stations were quieter now. The compliance pings ran on a negotiated schedule that both species had signed. The hum of inhabited space was still there. It was always going to be there. You couldn't share a galaxy with this other civilization and not hear it. But it had changed its quality. It had the hum of something working alongside, rather than something working over. Somewhere, 200 years ago and yesterday, and always, a woman with ink on her fingers, ran off the morning edition and pinned it to a board, and went back to her press because the work must not stop and the information mattered, and the right to make that information available to people who could decide what to do with it was the oldest thing human civilization had ever built. Karras stayed in the observation bay until the stars went from black to the deep blue of a pressurized morning. And then he went to find coffee. Because that was the next thing. And the next thing was always the thing you did. The tunnel was out there somewhere, cycling in its quiet way, the still water bending around something in the current, giving someone else their chance. He hoped they'd take it. He rather thought they would.